Okay, so thank you everyone and good afternoon. Dijon will probably keep admitting people, but I think we should go ahead and get started. So very nice to see everyone this afternoon. My name is Avital. I'm the incoming USA Haruv director and been in Tulsa for the past 5 weeks, and I'm really excited on starting this new role. With me is Dijon Knapp, our new coordinator. Dijon, you want to say hi also?
Hi, everyone.
So it's great to see you and thank you for coming. We're really excited about this lecture today, and I would like to introduce our presenter before we begin. And also, anyone who is not the presenter, please keep your mics muted. There are a lot of participants here, and that will really, I think, help us. We got until 3:30. So we're gonna, once we present me, we're gonna go ahead with her presentation, and you are all welcome to write some questions through the chat. We'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So go ahead and feel free if you have a question throughout to write it down, and we'll be sure to remind Amy at the end to give some time for questions. So again, I'm really happy to introduce Amy Pumo. Pumo, did I get it correctly, Amy?
Pumo, yes, thank you.
Pumo. She's a licensed clinical social worker and is the Director of Clinical Services at the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Ms. Pumo has 24 years of experience providing social services to youth and adults affected by trauma. She currently oversees the NYSPCC's Trauma Recovery Program and Therapeutic Supervised Visitation Program, helping youth and families recover after child sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and domestic violence. Prior to joining the NYSPCC, Ms. Pumo served for over 13 years as the founding program director for the Center for Court Innovation's Bronx Child Trauma Program at the Bronx District Attorney's Office, a trauma-focused therapy and court support service for youth and parents exposed to violent crime. She received her BA in psychology from Villanova University in 1996 and her MS in social work from Columbia University in 2000. Ms. Pumo is a licensed clinical social worker. So we're so glad you could come and for today, to arrive at this Zoom meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm very much looking forward to this time together. I would prefer for it to be in person. I am someone who really prefers an interactive presentation, so we're going to try to make the best use of the chat that we can. Now, is it possible to, have you shared the screen with me again? Or I'm able to share? Okay, let's see if I can get my presentation up. Can everyone see that okay? Great, okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and I hope everyone is managing okay in these incredibly trying times and staying safe and healthy. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. It is a child welfare organization located in New York City, and it is the first child welfare organization apparently in the world that was created in 1875. And in 1875, there was a famous case of a child named Mary Ellen who was being abused, and she was the first child to be formally removed through the court process from a home. And the lawyers who litigated her removal had to use animal welfare laws at the time because there were no laws protecting children. So we've been around for quite a while, and we continue to work hard to meet the complex needs of abused and neglected children. Okay. All right, so I'm going to get started. So I know that there aren't many folks here who are currently supervising therapeutic visitation, but that is what this presentation is about today. We're going to be talking about the important role that therapeutic supervised visitation can play in helping families heal after interfamilial trauma. And then key to that process is the issue of accountability for those who have been those who have caused harm, the parents or one of the parents, or one of the caregivers. And so we're going to be talking about why that's so important. in healing harm and creating positive behavior change for the parent. And then we're going to spend a little time at the end talking about how to facilitate healing by using a child-centered, trauma-focused, and strengths-based perspective. As was mentioned in the beginning, our organization does have a therapeutic supervised visitation program. All of our visitation therapists are licensed mental health professionals with experience in trauma treatment. So as many may be aware, visitation programs have a very significant responsibilities to the children and families they serve. We know that we can, through the visitation process, because it's often court-ordered and mandated, it can be something that can cause harm for children, or it can promote healing and safety for children. In my work, as was mentioned when we opened up, I had worked in the Bronx District Attorney's Office for many years, and through that work, I actually had seen many cases when visitation did lead to re-traumatization, which is what led me to be interested in coming into the visitation field. It's very complicated visitation when it's mandated, and there were many examples in my time at the DA's office of when it caused harm to the families who were ordered to participate. But there were also examples of times when a visitation could have actually been helpful in healing for the family. So I have one quick example of a young boy who I was working with. He was seeing me because his father had one day after school attacked him and his older sister. The father had wound up stabbing the older sister maybe 20 times or more, and then coming to attack the young boy who I was working with for trauma treatment. The sister was able to play dead, so the father left her to come to the boy I was working with. During that time, she ran out and got help, and then the police came, and the father fled. What was interesting, and the reason I'm bringing up this case, is because during the course of my work with him, about 4 months into doing the trauma treatment with him, I received a request from a judge asking for my recommendation as to whether or not visits should occur between the child and his father. I can't remember if I just mentioned this, but the father had slashed his throat. And it was complicated because the young boy really wanted to have visits with his father. He wanted to ask him why he did what he did. And he also wanted to see if his father was angry with him because he had told the police it was his father. When they had come to the house and asked who did this to you, he had told them the truth. And he was carrying around a tremendous amount of sense of self-blame and guilt for his father being incarcerated. So he really wanted to have the visits with his father. However, because I had no contact with his father, who was incarcerated, and would not be able to have contact with him, I was, clearly very concerned about whether or not that would be in the child's best interest, because there was potential for it to continue to be harmful, and the child was very traumatized, had lots of post-traumatic stress symptoms. So had I had the access to the father and been able to engage him in a therapeutic visitation context, then it's possible that the visits would have been very beneficial to the child and helped him in his healing process. But that's just an example of how it can be, it can be helpful, or you could have the concern that it could create more harm. So what I love about visitation program, therapeutic visitation in particular, is that it really brings a unique opportunity. We know that when there have been incidents of domestic violence or attempted homicides or sexual abuse, usually the treatment for the family is separated. So we have offender treatment, we have victim services treatment, and we don't really work with them together. And therapeutic supervised visitation offers that opportunity where you have access to both the custodial parent or the non-offending parent, as well as to the visiting parent, typically the parent who's caused harm. So today I'm talking about families who are coming for therapeutic visitation due to these different types of interfamilial traumas. We all know that the closer the relationship between the child and the person who has caused harm, the greater the expectation is that that person, especially a parent, would provide safety and protection to the child. So it's a profound betrayal when any of these different types of traumas occur. Okay, so we are going to take a quick poll. The question here is just checking in with what your thoughts are at this point in time. Do parents who seriously harm their child still deserve access to their child? I believe is what it said. Oh, yes. So if everyone could just take a minute to fill out that poll. And there is no right or wrong. Okay. So it looks about half of us are unsure, or the majority are unsure of that. 24% agree and 27% disagree. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I was hoping this would be one of the times that we would use the chat to get your ideas. What do you think are some of the potential risks for children if they've experienced harm from the parent, now they've been court ordered for visitation? What do you think some of the risks could be? If folks could just write into the chat, and I think Dijon will just read a few of those answers to me. Thank you.
Re-traumatization has already come up a couple of times, exposure to emotional abuse, major fear, separation anxiety, their experiences being invalidated, trauma triggers, re-traumatization, trying to influence testimony, guilt trip from parents, additional harm, wanting to please the offending parent, some concerns about behavioral problems, more trauma, parents making promises, readiness, gain approval.
Say that last one again, I'm sorry.
Gain approval, I think maybe the child, or parent, I guess, just trying to gain approval. They commented until parent has done their own work, complex dynamics and re-traumatization, emotional distress.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so I think you all covered all of the potential ways it could be harmful. It can also send a message to the child or the family who's been mandated from the systems that what happened wasn't a big deal or it didn't matter. And that in itself could be a re-traumatization. They can feel that their voice, often children who are mandated may, not always, but sometimes may not want to have the visit. So now they're being court ordered to have the visit. So it's not only the trauma, but now the system isn't hearing my voice. Feeling powerless. As many people mentioned, it can lead to their trauma symptoms being exacerbated. And I think that pretty much, and I think some people talked about how there could be worry about the custodial parents, so it can lead to the children being pulled in terms of loyalty binds. So it really has the potential to be damaging to children. And now folks can just put into the chat some of the potential benefits for children. What do you think could be helpful for kids being mandated for visits with the parent who's caused them harm?
One of the last comments I feel like is relevant to your question, Stephanie.
Great.
I believe it depends on whether the parent is able to accept responsibility for the role and what happened and have insight to impact on child. Somebody's already commented attachment, possibility of reunification. We had lots of comments flowing in on the negatives. They're slower on the positives.
Okay, great.
They're coming in now, Amy. Repair and making sure the child knows it's not their fault. That children should maintain family connections when it can be safe. Repair of the relationship, access to healing, closure, accountability for the offending parent and validation, trust, healing from trauma, chance for children to use their voice.
Absolutely. Great.
Motivate behavioral change.
Exactly. Yes. That's great. So, and that's what we're going to be talking about more today, but you all pretty much covered it. It really can be very powerful in terms of supporting the child's healing process. Sometimes children are quite worried about the other parent, and it can help them feel reassured that the parent is safe and okay. As someone mentioned, it can motivate the parent to do better and to work hard to help their children. So there are certainly benefits, and we'll go into more details about that in a little bit. So I know that there are many people on the call right now who do work with children and are mental health professionals. And so you're familiar with a lot of this. This is specific to what we see in visitation when children are ordered to participate. Their responses to the parent who's caused harm is unique. So you can have two siblings, similar experiences within the family, and both have very different responses to the parent. Obviously, it can be quite complex. There can be many different emotions and behavioral responses, some that seem to contradict one another. We have some children who come in and their response to the visiting parent changes from week to week, and others who day one have a particular response, such as, I do not want a relationship with them, I do not want to visit with them, and then they maintain that throughout the duration of the time they're receiving the service. Our program runs for 24 visits or approximately 6 months, sometimes longer. Clearly, children's responses to their parents are going to depend on what developmental stage they're in, what developmental stage they were in at the time that the harm was caused, to what degree they've experienced the harm. Have they just heard about it from other family members, or were they directly experiencing and witnessing the behavior? And then we know for those who've worked in visitation, it's incredibly complicated in terms of the messages they receive from other family members, whether it's the custodial parent or other siblings or other relatives, about what has happened and what it means. Sometimes overt messages, and sometimes more implicit messages that family members don't even realize they're sending or that their child is aware of. So in the visit rooms, we see, of course, post-traumatic stress symptoms, or even for kids who are refusing to go into the visit rooms, they can be avoidant, not wanting to see the parent. They can be very concerned and watching the parent the whole time throughout the visit. Conversely, they can be really withdrawn and not engaging. Of course, children will have negative beliefs about themselves, that they've done something wrong, or that the parent doesn't love them. We see a lot in visitation, a lot of children who have very rigid or polarized thinking about their parent. Typically, as I had mentioned before, a child who may say no, they can't remember anything positive about that parent. They can't think of any reason why it would be worth it for them to engage with them in any way, and they stick with that throughout the time that they're with us. Sometimes, more commonly in situations where we have children in foster care with a foster parent visiting a biological parent, they might idealize that biological parent and not remember any of the hardships or the reason why they were removed. So that kind of very rigid thinking. Sometimes we have children who are unreliable reporters about what has happened. Typically, when there's very high conflict between two parents, we'll see sometimes children who really embellish the history of what's happened, where it seems like it's kind of not possible that what they're reporting happened, even when you're a therapist who's been exposed to very significant trauma. Or we'll have children who might leave a visit and then report something happened that we know as the visitation therapist didn't occur. And then, as was mentioned in the chat, we can have children who are very concerned about how the parent is doing, wanting to please them throughout the visit and being overly compliant. And then when there are siblings, we often have children who have difficulty sharing the other parent's attention and may act out when they're not getting the full attention. Very common in supervised visitation, a parent will deny the harm, minimize it, even if the child is the one who's reporting the harm. the visiting parent will often claim that they've been coached by the other parent or other adults to say what they're saying. We see parents having difficulty empathizing or being willing to hear their child's perspective, again, just dismissing it as something they've been coached to say. We'll have parents who talk about what they went through as children and that they were able to get over it and their child should just get over it themselves. A lot of shame among the parents who participate in our program, where they feel quite ashamed about who they are as a parent and very down on lacking confidence in their parenting skills. And then, of course, we have parents, this especially comes up when there are children in foster care, but in many of the cases, even not in foster care, where they're very concerned about what the other caregivers are doing. They, look at their child from head to toe to make sure everything's okay. They're suspicious about them continuing to experience abuse in other contexts. And then we have parents who can try to overcompensate by showering them with gifts or just, being so fun and playful and not really engaging in any of the parenting skills, such as setting limits and having consequences for unhelpful behavior. So again, this is about this unique opportunity that we have in visitation to help shift these dynamics. And we know that looking at parent accountability is an important component of that. Excuse me one second. Okay, and yeah, and the reason I have it, the address, the little star there is because just to be realistic, we don't always accomplish and get as far in parent accountability as we want to in the work, but we want to at least plant the seeds and do our best to try to address it. The way that I came to really understand the importance of accountability was through my work at the District Attorney's Office, working with victims of violent crime, child victims of violent crime. It really was remarkable. Over and over again, I always heard them talk about the importance of the person who hurt them admitting to what they had done. And children and teenagers who didn't necessarily even want the perpetrator or the person who caused harm to have a consequence, like going to jail, but they just wanted them to acknowledge the reality of what happened and sometimes to apologize to them. So that was where I really learned about how important accountability is for healing. So today we're going to be talking about that some more, what it is and how it helps heal harm. So this is an exercise that's really great in person because we partner up and have a conversation about that. But since we're not in person, I would like to take, it is quite important for understanding the concept. So it's 3:25. I'd like everybody to take the next 5 minutes to think about these questions. And try to avoid the temptation to look on your phone, but to actually just take a minute to have some quiet time and think about a time when someone did something to hurt you and you felt wronged. Anything in your history where you felt that someone did something that was wrong to you, what they could have or did say or do to help repair that damage, and how it did or would have helped you to feel better. And so I'm going to ask us to spend the 5 minutes to think about those questions, and then we're just going to have some of the responses entered into the chat. So I'm sorry, it's 2:25 your time, correct? So we'll get back exactly at 2:30 to talk about some of those answers. Just take a couple minutes. Okay, so maybe if folks could start writing in the chat the answer to question number 2, which is what the person who caused harm to you could have said or done to help the repair the damage they had caused. And maybe, Dijon, you could read that out for us.
Yeah, we already had some really thoughtful comments before you said specifically for number 2. So we had a participant say, as a child, they're not sure that apologizing would have helped repair the damage, but as an adult, forgiveness was granted. Not only because she needed to forgive him for her, because they needed to forgive him for their own sake, not for him. But then once they forgave him, they could realize and understand it wasn't their fault, and then was able to forgive themselves for what had happened. Somebody said it would be helpful to hear, like, I did this, I'm sorry, I won't do it again, and then have the behavior follow that and not experience that trauma anymore. Someone stated, model the desired behavior, hearing that a mistake was made and how the person would work to make sure it didn't happen again, what was different and why, hearing the person acknowledge that it caused harm to me. I think it would have been helpful to hear why that person made that choice. Then I may have been able to relate to the feeling, making forgiveness easier. Someone shared they still struggle daily because they were never told, I'm sorry, it wasn't your fault. Acknowledge the hurt, not invited to a family event because in-laws were there. Admitting they had done wrong and seeking help to address their problem would be a great beginning. A lot of comments, I'm sorry, this wasn't your fault. Seems to be coming up again, that would have been helpful to have, was helpful or would have been helpful.
Great. And then if folks could share, how would that have been helpful? What would that have done for you? I think some people started to mention that, knowing that it wasn't their fault. Are there any other ideas about how hearing that from the person who hurt you could have helped you to feel better and move on?
Trust is coming up, help in the healing process, commitment to moving forward together, validate that it actually happened, knowing that my feelings about what happened were real, I would not have walked on eggshells so much of my life. It would be a start to begin to forgive and move forward, that I didn't blame myself. I would have had less of a negative opinion of myself. Self-blame is such a huge part of trauma experience. Absolving that responsibility is huge.
Absolutely.
A lot.
Okay, great. And we're going to think about how we can apply this to working with families when a parent has caused harm as we move through the presentation. But thank you all for those responses, and you'll see that you've covered a lot of what I am about to cover. So I'd also like us to just be aware that accountability can happen on different levels, both on the individual, the family, the community, the societal level, and of course today we're focusing more on the individual and the family level. So some of you answered this when you were answering question 2. These are different elements of accountability. We don't, unfortunately, achieve all of them in every time when we're working with someone and trying to support them in taking responsibility for what they've done. But I know someone said this in the chat, acknowledges the behavior. They clearly define what they did. So not just I'm sorry about what happened, but I'm sorry that I sexually abused you, acknowledging that the behavior is wrong and it's a crime, or that it violated a social or relationship principle. So I was your father, I was not supposed to do that, that was wrong of me to do that. Another important aspect of it is taking full responsibility, not externalizing any of the blame. It's because I was drinking, it was because your mother, knows how to trigger me that I became violent with her, etc. So we want to make, or it was, you know, because you were just the only person who paid me attention, and that's why I sexually abused you, etc. So we need the person responsible to take full responsibility that it was them, their decision making, their choices that led to the harm. Key to helping helping the survivor heal is understanding the impact it has had on them, acknowledging that harm, demonstrating through words and actions that one regrets what they did, that they wish they had done better, that they're sorry for what they've done.
Amy, there's an interesting point that was raised through the chat, that accountability, or at least full accountability, can be difficult if there are pending criminal charges. Maybe you can say something about that from your experience.
Sorry, pending criminal charges? Yes, that is something that I have cover in the end of the presentation, just that there are serious challenges. There can be challenges, and of course that's one of them. The fact that, if there are either criminal or family court cases underway. We do have parents who come to the program who have been advised by their lawyers that they shouldn't admit to anything that they've done. And we acknowledge that with the parents who we work with. We are straightforward with them about what we can keep private and what we can't keep private. And then we also just talk about prioritizing what's the most important to them. We explain to them the value that it may have for their child's healing, individual healing, for their the healing in their relationship. And of course, we don't urge them either way. We just give them the information and let them decide. But we know that it's incredibly important for them to do that for the sake of the child. But we can talk about that more, toward the end as well. This was also in one of the chats, one of the comments in the chat, to commit to change. So the person who's caused harm makes it clear that they're not going to engage in the behavior again, and then they take steps toward making sure that they don't repeat it. So it's not just about understanding and using words, but it's actually taking action to change and to stop the behavior. Asking the survivor or the victim what they need what they want from the person who's caused the harm, how can they help make it better, and then following through with that. And then I think someone else in the chat also mentioned wanting to understand what the root causes of the harmful behavior are. So it doesn't mean, again, blaming other things, but maybe trying to understand, where did I learn this from? What led to me making these decisions, so that the survivor has a better understanding and can develop greater compassion. And I heard a lot of the word forgiveness in the chat, and so this is sometimes part of that process. So, and you all, started providing the answers in terms of how does this help the one who has been harmed. Those of you who are in the trauma field, and you'd likely be familiar with Judith Herman, and she outlined stages of healing as these 3 distinct stages. And they can certainly overlap, but safety and stabilization, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection. And most trauma treatments incorporate these 3 straight stages in the work that they do. And I think that accountability really has a role in the remembrance and mourning stage, when one is telling their trauma story, when we're identifying the ways it's negatively impacted the way they view themselves in the world. For example, cognitive distortion such as there's something wrong with me, I did something to deserve this, you can't trust adults, etc. Sense of self, I know someone mentioned self-esteem, grieving the losses of, if you had a parent who hurt you, there is a loss in acknowledging that the parent was not a parent to you in the way that you deserved, and then making meaning of the experience. All of those are typically for trauma survivors done without the person who has caused harm playing a role in this. But in visitation, we have the person who has caused harm accessible to us, and that person has the ability to help the survivor with this process if they can appropriately take responsibility. And so, again, some of these things were mentioned. It breaks the conspiracy of silence. Often, families, when they come to our program, they've actually never discussed what's happened. You know, parents and children haven't discussed it with one another, or they don't discuss it with anybody in their lives. So that's very important that we acknowledge it. It also, it always was fascinating to me that visitation programs would have the goal of reconnecting the parent and the child, but never discuss what had happened that led them to visitation. And that seems such a invalidation of you know, the child's reality of the experience. And so this is another way that helping the family move towards accountability can help with that. We've already talked about helping correct the cognitive distortions or negative beliefs that can develop. Children have the ability to express themselves, to have a voice when they felt voiceless. We sometimes have cases, visitation cases, where it doesn't end in the child agreeing to visit or agreeing to a relationship, but they've had the opportunity to describe the impact the harm has had on them, and describe the reason why they're making the decision they are to the visiting parent, and that is really helpful for their healing process. Many people talked about forgiveness, so having forgiveness for the behavior, for the person, not the behavior, because we all know that holding on to anger and rage over what someone has done can be toxic for the person who's the survivor. Of course, it's important at certain points, but at some point it's helpful to let go of that if you can. And then, of course, people raised the issue of attachment. It can help to heal that rupture in the relationship. And it was also mentioned in the chat, this idea of how it impacts our relationships with others. And so not only can this a healing conversation with the parent who's caused harm, whether it results in you reuniting in your relationship or not, it can just help break the cycle of intergenerational trauma and help you have help the survivor have healthier relationships with others in their lives, because they are able to regain a sense of being able to trust and trusting themselves and trusting others. And then thinking about, well, how does it help the person who's caused harm? It's not only for the survivor who it benefits, but it is also the person who has caused harm. So we know that they can feel great accomplishment and proud of being able to stop the intergenerational cycle. The vast majority of the parents who participate in our program have experienced their own traumas as children. It helps them to feel more confident in who they are, who they want to be, and who they actually are. They develop a greater sense of control that, again, they can use in relationships with others. Of course, we all know that growing, feeling redeemed is something that is a positive for all of us. They can reframe their own thinking of themselves. Instead of thinking of themselves as not being a good parent, they can realize that they actually can help their children, that they have made significant, serious mistakes, but that they can do better in the future. And as we've talked about, it can improve their connection to not only their child, but to other people in their lives. Okay, so we're going to take another poll. With enough support, do you believe most parents who cause harm can take accountability and become safe? Okay. Interesting. The first question was, the parents deserve to see the children after they've caused harm, and a lot fewer people believed in that. But folks are believing that with enough support, parents who cause harm can take accountability and become safe. Okay, thank you.
Amy, just a heads up, you're about at your halfway point, okay?
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
We're making good time. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about supporting accountability and positive behavior change. It's not something, I just thought this quote was helpful. We cannot force accountability, but we can create conditions that make taking responsibility more rewarding and compelling than avoiding it. And that was taken from a really excellent resource, if anybody's interested, Ending Child Sexual Abuse, a Transformative Justice Handbook. So the approach that we take in our program is balancing out these, what you see here on this image, focusing on connecting to the humanity of all parents who come into our program, finding their strengths, providing them with empathy for their life experiences and the challenges that they have faced, giving them the opportunity to do better, and helping them develop a sense of connection. A lot of the parents who participate in our program feel alone. They can feel dismissed by the different systems who are working with them, whether it's the criminal justice system or the family child welfare system. And so this is really something that we try to meet to help them, address whatever their concrete needs are and really see them as people who are worthy of our support and attention. We also in our program have a mandatory parent group. And we really create, it's a 12-week group. We use the parenting journey model, which some of you may be familiar with, and we've adapted it for our population. It's really been amazing how the positive impact it has on our parents. They kick and scream about not wanting to have to participate in the parent group, but the group looks at what they've experienced as children and how that influences the decisions they make as adults. And it really focuses on their strengths and their goals. And they've really described it as being like no other experience they've had with the different system responders involved in their lives. So that's, one of the ways that we really try to help them feel seen as people. And then, of course, we balance it out with being clear about what's okay and not okay, refocusing them whenever, often parents will talk about, well, the other parent or the child does this, and we always bring them back to themselves, what they have control over. We're not an offender treatment program, and so we're very clear about that. We understand there are limits to what we can do, but we want to make sure that we're always supporting them in understanding the impact of the choices that they're making, and we always prioritize the child's needs, and so we try to create that balance and believe that this is, yes.
So sorry if I interrupted. Just a couple of questions. One of them, could you maybe touch base on the setting of how you work with parents? You mentioned the parent group. Is it like each session is before meeting the child? Is it with the parents? How does it work, like more technically, so we will kind of be able to picture it? And also with the chat, someone was asking if you could repeat that name of, I think it was that book for the, maybe it was the process that you referred to, maybe it was that one of those
the book, yeah, at the end of the PowerPoint, which I believe everybody's getting, there's a list of resources, and the book is listed on that. In terms of, sorry about not providing the context. So our program is a 6-month program, approximately. We engage in pre and post visit coaching with visiting parents. So we have weekly hour visits every week for 24 times, sometimes longer if it's needed for clinical purposes. And we meet with the visiting parent before each visit. We meet with them after each visit. We provide child coaching as needed. So sometimes it's every week, sometimes it's less frequently, depending on what the child's needs are. And we also have a dedicated custodial parent specialist, because of course the custodial parent's perspective and needs has a significant influence on how the child responds to the visiting parent. So we have a dedicated therapist who meets weekly with custodial parents to support them through the visitation process as well. Every parent is mandated to participate in a parent group. Every visiting parent is mandated to participate in a parent group, and that meets for 12 weeks. It's 2 hours each time, and it meets on a different day, not the day of their visit. And we provide them, before COVID, we would meet in person in the office and have a really nice family-style meal together to, reinforce the idea of nurturing and being connected. And now we're doing it virtually, but surprisingly, they're enjoying it as much virtually as they had in person. And I think it's really about just not feeling alone and feeling seen as a human being beyond just the harmful actions that they've engaged in.
Amy,
so hopefully that gives more context. Sure.
About a fee associated with the program for the non-custodial parents in the 6-month program, someone had asked.
Oh, so the program is free for everyone. We do not charge families. We specialize in providing the service to low-income families only, and we do that through government grants as well as support from private grants from foundations. Okay, so and I'm about to talk a little bit more about how our program works as well. And so this is these are three values or orienting concepts that we apply to the work that we do. So we're child-centered, and we're trauma-focused, and we're strengths-based. So all of our interventions are driven by the needs of the children, and we really work hard to step away from the idea that this is about making a visit happen, having a child enter a visit with a parent and spending time together. Of course, that is a goal. But it's really more important about what does the child need to feel safe and supported in this relationship. Our focus isn't just on the here and now, but on how they got here and where do they want to go and how do we help them through that. Our program is also trauma focused, so we do engage in a comprehensive intake with all family members, custodial parents, children. If it's not a custodial parent, for example, a foster parent is a custodial parent, but I mean, if it's not a biological parent, we'll still obtain their trauma histories. We provide psychoeducation as part of what we do every week with all members of the family about what trauma is, how it impacts children and adults, how to best manage their symptoms and support them through that process. We do refer folks out for trauma treatment, because this is not trauma treatment, but we incorporate aspects of trauma treatment into all the work that we do. We know that hurt people, and so we acknowledge that with all the members. And I should add, it's not always clear cut that the visiting parent is the one who's caused harm and the custodial parent has not. Sometimes they both have, and so we do address that with all parties. And we also acknowledge not just the intergenerational trauma they've experienced maybe in their families of origin, but also systemic and historical trauma, such as institutional racism, et cetera. We do try to be comprehensive in acknowledging that. We're also strengths-based, so with every person we work with, we look at, we acknowledge their resilience, we look at what they are doing well and what they're working hard to do. We do believe that both parents play an important role in their child's life. Even if the parent is absent, the absent parent is playing a role in the child's life. So we acknowledge that and try to motivate both parents to work hard to meet their child's needs, and that's both custodial and visiting parents. We do believe that parents can experience emotional growth and stop harmful behaviors. It doesn't always happen when they're in our program. Sometimes they're not ready for that, but we still have the belief that they can get there. And I believe that you have to have that belief in order to really support them effectively. And of course, we believe that parent-child relationships can strengthen and heal, but of course, the parent has to be ready. The parent has to be the one who is pushing that forward. Okay, so in terms of how we discuss the harm, as was mentioned, we're very clear and transparent about confidentiality and its limits as it relates to what we have to share with courts, what we have to share with child welfare, what we have to share among family members. If a child tells us something that we feel, whether it's the custodial parent or the visiting parent, that they need to know, we are clear and transparent with the children about that. We, of course, consider each family member's readiness. So some families get very far in the process and some do not, because one of the family members or several of the family members are just not in the place where they can do this work. Those families who have received trauma treatment prior to coming to our visitation program, those families where there has been offender treatment or substance abuse treatment prior to coming to our program, typically are in a better position to engage in the work. But we do have families who are able to do it successfully without having been involved in those different types of programs. We're very direct from day one about what we understand about the reason that they've been referred. We're very careful about sharing information that one family member gives us about another family member, so we never share information that would compromise another family member's safety. For example, if a custodial parent talks to us about domestic violence with the visiting parent, we're not going to go ahead and tell the visiting parent what they've told us if it's potentially not safe. So we make sure everybody knows what's being shared. We, of course, consider how the child is doing in their life, they're functioning at school and at home, and work with the parents to decide how we have these conversations, how we frame it, what language we use. And we look at how it's affecting all the family members as individuals, and then how it's affecting the parent-child relationships. We don't get involved with the parent-to-parent relationships unless it's two parents or caregivers who are further along and are able to co-parent and maybe don't have orders of protection. Then we will engage them with co-parenting, in terms of co-parenting. So when we're discussing the harm with parents, it's really important to acknowledge that we all cause harm in certain ways. Of course, it's to different degrees, but we all make mistakes. I'm a parent myself. I've made countless mistakes that I share with all of our visiting parents, because there is no perfect parent, and we all have caused harm even when we haven't wanted to. So we do talk about this openly with parents, and it's not to minimize the seriousness of what's happened and what they've done, but to hopefully reduce some of the shame and just acknowledge our shared imperfections as human beings. We really use what the child shares with us as much as possible, and what we observe in the children and what is reported to us about how the children are doing, because that seems the most helpful motivator for the parent to understand the impact of what they've done, to frame it from the child's perspective, not from the other parent's perspective, for example. And as already mentioned, we maintain the focus on the parents' choices and behaviors. A lot of time there's, discussion about, oh, but the other parent, or but the child does this, the child does that. And we try to really talk to them about, let's focus on what you can control. We also, during intake, talk with parents about and really try to understand what their values are as parents, and what they hope their legacy to be as parents. We'll even ask that question, think about your child being older adults and you no longer, being alive, And what would you like them to say about who you were as a parent? What would that sound like? And we document that and we use it. We go back to their legacy goals and their parenting values throughout the course of the service to keep them motivated, and it's a very important aspect of the work that we do. And of course, we want to help them feel hopeful. We have parents who participate in our program, and they actually never see their children in our program because the child refuses, but they're able to leave feeling like they've gained something and feeling hopeful for the future. So even in those circumstances, we can have hope. So I'm not going to review all these questions, but these are some of the questions that we ask parents to help them start thinking about things from their child's perspective. Sometimes, some parents are able to do it more readily than others. Some really have difficulty seeing things from their child's perspective. So we'll maybe ask them what it was like for them as a child. What might they have wanted their parent to do or say to have helped them. With the children, these are some of the questions that we ask them to try to encourage them to engage in this process. We find, as many of you I'm sure know, children will always find a way to blame themselves. Whatever has happened in the family, they'll think it has to do with something that they have done. And so it's really helpful when kids can tell that to us and we can communicate to that parent. Even if a parent really can't take responsibility for what they've done or, acknowledge it because of criminal court cases or whatnot, if they're able to say if they're able to say that it wasn't because of what the child did, that can be incredibly helpful. No, it wasn't because you always had trouble with your homework or because you didn't listen to me. That's not why I left. Even though they're falling short of saying I left because I was abusive to your mom, they're still addressing the underlying concern that the child has, that it was something that they had done. Okay, so we don't have any healing conversations with families unless the parent is ready to have that conversation. We've talked about it ahead of time, and we know that that parent is going to respond in a way that's appropriate and helpful for the child. We do set limits at the start of the therapeutic services in terms of what's okay to talk about and what isn't as we progress. So because we do sometimes have families who either the parent or the child wants to come in and first visit, confront them for about what happened, and we really discourage and stop visits if that's happening before the family is ready to have a productive conversation that's healing for the child. And then before we have conversations, we spend a lot of time being very specific. We don't leave anything a surprise. So what are you going to ask? This is how your parent's going to answer. How's that going to feel? And we do it, with all parties involved. We bring the custodial parent into the process, of course, separately from the visiting parent, but to let them know what's happening so that they can adequately support their child. We try to give children as many choices as they can have in terms of where is everybody going to sit? Who's going to start the question? Who's going to start the conversation? Who gets to ask the question first? How long do you want it to be? Sometimes kids want to have things timed. They want to be able to take breaks at certain periods. So we plan all of that ahead of time. Of course, as the therapist, we help guide the discussion. And then we always talk with family members afterward to see what the experience was like for them. Sometimes we think it went terrible, but in the family's perspective, it was really meaningful for them, or vice versa. So that check-in afterwards is always important. And we also, often refer families for additional services after their work with us. So it could be for parent-child therapy, trauma treatment, abusive partner intervention, et cetera, if we feel that we haven't quite gotten as far as we wanted to, and if the family needs more support. So in terms of challenges, this was already mentioned. Of course, the criminal legal child welfare systems often work contrary to our goals with accountability. It doesn't actually benefit a parent to acknowledge what they have done. And so we acknowledge that with families at the beginning, you know, convey an understanding for the dilemma that they may be in, and let them make the choice in terms of how they want to proceed. It can also be challenging when the facts aren't clear. And we also work with children who are young, you know, infants, toddlers, and under 5. So we can't really use their perspective in the work, which can be challenging. Sometimes parents can be saying that we have limited documentation about what's happened, and parents can be saying polar opposite things about what has occurred. And so when that happens, we do our best just to provide psychoeducation about trauma, about how parental conflict impacts children. So regardless of what's the cause or who's right or who's wrong, this is how it's affecting, or it could affect your child or is affecting your child, and what can we do to make that better. And as was mentioned, family members are at different stages of readiness, and so they don't always, it doesn't always work out that we can engage in healing conversations, but we try to make sure that at the end of services, we're passing the family members on to the services that we believe would help them be more ready. And then another challenge is just ensuring safety. You know, these are serious acts of harm that are committed against children, like physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence. We know that we can't guarantee that even though this parent seems to understand, seems to take responsibility, seems to be motivated and working hard to not engage in that behavior again, we can't guarantee that. And of course, you know, that's a challenge for us as therapists, and it's a challenge for the family members, custodial parents, and for children. So we don't want to be giving anyone false senses of safety. So we try to just, you know, be clear about what this means, what it may not mean, and prepare them for whatever safety issues, you know, they may face in the future. So it's very difficult work, but this is another quote from the book that I mentioned. We have the capacity, individually and collectively, to reflect on the world we want and to align our behavior and our choices with that vision. And I think that sums it up quite well. Visitation, therapeutic visitation, and doing this work with a focus on accountability is incredibly challenging. It's very complicated and complex, and it's very hard on the therapist. We have to provide a lot of support because the behaviors that parents come in with, the way that they treat the therapist, their responses to what has happened, it can be very hard. And so, you know, we work hard to support one another through this process. And we often are greatly rewarded by the work that we do, and sometimes not, but we know that you know, our goal is to plant the seed for the families. I think a little bit ahead of time and ready for questions.
Amy, a while back, someone had asked, do you have suggestions for specific trauma-informed assessments or process of screening to determine appropriateness of fit or readiness for program? I know you shared some of those questions that you asked the parent, but.
Okay, I'm sorry, can you read that to me again?
Do you have suggestions for specific trauma-informed assessments, or do you have a process of screening to determine appropriateness of fit of the parents / readiness for the program?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we don't assess them for readiness, in the sense that the only criteria to be admitted to the program is that they have to be low income, there has to be a court order for visitation, and there has to have been one of the traumas that was mentioned earlier: sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence, attempted homicide, and neglect. So no, we don't assess for readiness, and that's why we have parents in varying stages of readiness to participate in the program. We do administer trauma assessment screens. We use a trauma exposure history. We don't use the ACEs form, but we have a comprehensive list of potential traumas, including racial trauma, police brutality, etc., that we ask parents, both custodial parents and visiting parents, when they come in for intake. And we use several other instruments. Oh gosh, what are the names on this? We've created a few assessment instruments that we use, internally to look at how the parent is attuning to the child, if they're setting limits in terms of safety, just sort of here and now behavior in the visit room. So yeah, I think that's all I've got on that one.
This was a really good question that just came in. How do you handle reporting to the court about recommendations? We just write them in the court report. So we'll that's sort of the last thing we write in the court report. It's recommended for this reason. It's recommended that so-and-so participate in such and such program. Yeah, so we're very transparent about that. Question from earlier: how do you work with parents that blame their kids for the separation due to ongoing court cases and what the kid has said?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. Again, we'll provide psychoeducation on these issues. We'll use the perspective that the child shares with us. And we'll spend a lot of time talking with parents about the role of a parent versus the role of a child, who has responsibility for what happens in a relationship, trying to help the parent think that, we spend time talking about the parent's childhood as well, to try to help get them in the frame of mind of a child's perspective. But, to be honest, there are some parents who, have quite a hard time doing that. We may never really get to the place where they move past that. I think for the majority of parents, we are able to help them move past that, but there are some who we are unable to.
Someone made a comment, actually it's a former colleague, and they sent it to me privately. I think they meant to share it with everyone, but they said, and here in Oklahoma, LPCs are not allowed to give recommendations for their license regulations. So how would you suggest therapists working with clients in family and juvenile court settings to help advocate for their clients that are children?
They're not allowed to provide recommendations to court. Is that what that means?
That's what it looks like. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't really understand that, but I guess, could one advocate with whoever is the caregiver for the child? Did you say these are children in juvenile detention?
I believe that these are children in state custody.
Okay, state custody. Well, wouldn't that mean working with child welfare caseworkers to make recommendations? So if you're not, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's the conflict is, yes, they are working with those systems. And Jordan, you can fill in here at any point. But then their license regulates that they can't. Like, I guess, Jordan, is it like?
This is Jordan.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Jordan Gustin. I'm an LPC and a children's therapist here at Divis. in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And our LPC guidelines in Oklahoma say very clearly that you cannot give recommendations to the courts. And so you do have to be a forensic licensed professional counselor in order to give recommendations to the court. So it gets really complex because we're not able to actually give the court a recommendation. So usually we can say things like, we would encourage, or strongly support, but it gets really murky and it makes our advocacy for children really difficult.
And I'm sorry about my ignorance on this, but what does LPC stand for? Licensed
professional counselor.
Oh, okay. Okay, we don't have those in New York State, so I'm unfamiliar with the term. Well, just to be clear, ours is just a strong encouragement as well. Not that courts listen to us. We're just sharing what we think would be best for the family. And we, of course, share that with the individual parents and whoever are the system, responders working with them. And then we also will extend our service based on parents' agreement, not necessarily waiting for the court to tell us to extend the service. We'll extend the service if we feel that it would be clinically helpful to have some more time with the family. So sorry, I'm sure that wasn't really a helpful answer, but I don't know how to help you on that one.
I think it was helpful, Amy.
Okay.
There were several people asked if you would mind sharing the assessments that you had mentioned that you used to evaluate during the visits.
Those are, some of them are internally created, so I don't think I would be able to share that, but I can send you, Dejan, the assessments that we use, just in the general assessments we use for trauma exposure. We also use the protective factor instrument, which I think is readily available, but I can follow up with you to share what we can.
Okay, great. There were several people that were asking more about those, so appreciate that. I think unless people have additional questions, I think you've covered. There were a couple that were asked earlier that you've answered in toward the end of your presentation. Avital, did you notice any that I missed?
Not that you've missed it. I was kind of wondering about what you mentioned regarding historical trauma and those and maybe institutionalized trauma. You said that you do. Is it something that I was kind of interested in hearing more about? That is it just at the assessment stage, or also later on during the intervention?
I mean, certainly in the assessment stage, and then throughout, depending on the parent's need or willingness to engage in that topic. But I think certainly, depending on, sometimes we do have international parents who come from countries where there has been significant community violence over time. And we also acknowledge with our families of color the impact of slavery, the impact of current day institutional racism. So depending on how pertinent that feels to the parent and the parent's place and the parent and parenting, they sort of guide how much we get involved in that kind of dialogue. But we do certainly open it up by acknowledging that and inviting that focus if it's something that feels important to the parent. And it's significant for parents who are separated from their children when they're unable to guide their children in terms of these issues. So that's something that we do incorporate.
There's a new question, Amy, that came in. How do you manage child refusal for visits? In which situation, if at all, would you not accept a family for visitation services?
We don't accept families if there has been a recent act of violence in the context, and this has happened infrequently, but if we're getting a referral because a visiting parent just punched a window in the last visitation center in front of the child, and now it's 2 weeks later and they're referring to us, we will say no. That parent needs to have, additional support. Obviously, they're not controlling their violence, and once they've, received some additional treatment, you can re-refer in the future. That would probably be the only situation where we say no to a family. And then we do end services if we have a party who is, usually a visiting parent who is actively engaging in threats of violence or acts of violence, on site or, threatening to do so. So we would end services in that situation too. Were there two parts to that question? I feel like there was another one.
The first part was about if the child refuses.
Yeah, I mean, if the child refuses, we just work on understanding the reason for the refusal, acknowledging that impact, sharing with the child the opportunity to use this time to help that parent understand the impact of their behavior on the child. We do have some cases where the child never goes into the visit, but they're engaged for the 6 months, and every visit the therapist is meeting part of the time with the child, part of the time with the visiting parent, and is facilitating communication between them, not live communication, but sharing messages between them that address the trauma and the reason for the refusal. So as I had mentioned earlier, we try not to, although we want, when it's safe to do so, we want to help families reunite and, re-engage in that relationship. But we also feel it is successful when we help children to have their voice be heard, to communicate their needs, and to have parents understand the child's perspective. So that would be a successful intervention if we've accomplished just that.
Okay, a couple of questions just about, can you talk more about what a typical visit looks like and the provider's role in the visit?
Sure. A typical visit would really vary from family to family in terms of the family's particular interests. Of course, there's always, and depends on the age of the child, but we certainly start with what the child likes to do. They can, sometimes engage in drawing together, playing games, dancing, looking at photo albums of the family members, or reminiscing about past times together. But it really depends on where the family comes in terms of their connection. The visitation therapist is very actively involved. We engage in planning with the visiting parent before the visit starts, and with the child to talk with them about what they would like to do during the visit. As I mentioned earlier, we do let them know from the beginning that we are going to have the goal of talking about the reason the family is with our agency, the reason they are separated, but we work towards that goal over time. We're not going to start there. So we engage them in fun activities to the extent that we can. It depends. There are sometimes dynamics, usually maybe with an older child and a parent, where it's hard for them to have fun together. So we work on just helping them spend the whole time just playing the game, Would You Rather? Some of you may be familiar with that game. Would you rather live at the beach or an ocean? The beach or the mountains. Just something to slow things down and help them get to know each other again. So it really depends where the family is, but the visitation therapist is part of the planning, part of intervening during the visit to help the family engage with one another in a fun or productive way. And then they meet with the visiting parent and often the child separately afterward to talk about what it was like, what were the moments where you felt connected, what was hard, what might you have wanted to have done differently, what do you feel proud of.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Are there any other questions for Amy?
Well, I think our time is almost up. So Amy, I would like to thank you so much. This has been very, very fascinating, and everyone has raised all these important questions. And some people have written in the chat that obviously this is such a challenging topic that we probably could all use some more time to discuss it and exchange ideas. But I'm really glad we had at least this one shot at kind of delving into this important world. I'd also like to tell everyone, and I just written it in the chat also, that we have launched a new Haruv USA website, and you are all very welcome to visit it, sign up to our newsletter, in which we'll tell you more about more trainings that we'll have, and you can also find materials regarding past trainings that we have already done. So kind of look through the slides and other materials, and the address is written up there in the chat. So thank you everyone for participating today. Thank you, Amy, so much for this lecture. Thank you, Dijon and Esther, the Haruv team, which is Haruv USA team, and Paula, our Haruv, our colleague from Haruv Israel. Thank you for being with us tonight. We will send the slides to participants. Some of you asked during the meeting, so don't worry, we will definitely do that. We wish everyone to stay safe and hope to see you at more of our trainings. We have one tomorrow coming up. If you haven't heard of it yet, go ahead and write us and we'll give you some more details. So sorry for doing that ad bit at the end, but so social worker / marketing. It's going to be my new. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.